You see, it's really very difficult to convey the events of even 50 years ago in a country like Persia, which was so backward in those days, especially the part that I come from. Yazd was 50 years behind time. And so the things that I have seen then are things that even my contemporaries in other parts of Persia hadn't seen, you see. We were living, in those days, the Baha'i community were so much surrounded by the enemies of the faith that you can say we had two different camps. One was our camp as Baha'is, we were as Baha'is, and one was the other. So we had a very clear community. We were living in our own community. And in fact, we were even self-sufficient in many ways. Even for daily life, we were self-sufficient. Yet, it was very clear that we grew up in the faith. And it was no question of having a foot in the other world, in the outside world and in your own community. We were there, and therefore Baha'is grew up as really Baha'is with deep roots, and the devotion of the friends knew no bounds. Now, of course, although I was born just at the end of the heroic age, that's when Abdu'l-Bahá passed away. I was when the formative age came, and that was the period that we are talking about during Shoghi Effendi's ministry, there were great many of the disciples of Bahá'u'lláh that I sort of grew up amongst them. And although I don't want to talk about myself really at all, but I must say that my father was one of those disciples of Bahá'u'lláh, one of those people who had been with him for some time, for about 9 months in Akka. And these believers, these early believers who had met with Bahá'u'lláh, they were a different caliber of men. Not because they were more outstanding in many ways from us, but in fact, from the point of view of ordinary knowledge and education, comparing it with the present day, they had nothing. But yet they were great spiritual giants of this dispensation because, you know why? It's because they came in touch with the manifestation of God. It's like a piece of iron which becomes magnetized. When you come close to the magnet, that piece of iron is no longer a piece of iron, it becomes a magnet. And therefore these early disciples of Bahá'u'lláh, those people who belong to the heroic age of the faith, they were like mountains of steadfastness. Nothing shook them, nothing ever affected them. They grew up as spiritual giants. They really were giants. This world meant nothing to them. And this is why they gave their lives with great joy. And so now having the world in those days were very different around us. We were cut off from the communication point of view from the rest of the world. For instance, we were living in the summertime in villages there, and these villages are surrounded by mountains. And people who lived there, they had never been out of that village. They lived in that village all their lives, and there were no such thing as newspapers, television, radios, nothing at all. And so we were sort of a small community of our own, only living and trying to live in accordance with the teachings of Bahá'u'lláh, and surrounded by the enemies. And that's another part of it. And we were always persecuted, people who throw stones at you, or your children even. I couldn't go to school ever on my own. Somebody had to accompany me, an adult. And even then he was beaten up so many times that once actually his eardrum broke and he became fully deaf, completely deaf. So you see, we had this particular, but that the joy of being a Baha'i was tremendous. And the believers had such faith, such reliance on Baha'u'lláh. They had nothing else but to rely on him. Such reliance that it's not possible to describe it. And they were mostly, quite a number of them were illiterates. Although quite a lot of them were educated, but quite a number of them were illiterates. Now, now that I have come to Alaska, I must tell you something. Because on the way, I was flying from London to here, and it took 8 hours, and we went over the pole, you see. And my thoughts during this flight went back to the days of my childhood. And I'll tell you why. You know, when we were growing up in those days, there were no such things as cars. There were no such thing as even bicycles. As a little boy of maybe 7 or 8, I'd never seen a bicycle. We couldn't visualize a bicycle. We couldn't visualize a car. There was no electricity. Nothing. None of these things. And I remember this. And when I was flying, this time in the jet coming over, this thought came to me very vividly. My thoughts went back to the earlier days, because in those days, I remember this very clearly. Maybe I was 7 or 8 years of age. And I still remember this. That we were sitting in this great gathering of the believers. Many, many hundreds. And quite a number of them were illiterates. But don't underestimate the illiterate Baha'is of those days. They knew the writings so well. Many of them had memorized the writings. I remember many of these people who were illiterates, you would ask them to chant some tablets in a meeting. And he would say, on what subject? And he would choose, you would say such and such a subject. And he could, in his memory, he could chant it for about half an hour. You see, one of the writings of Bahá'u'lláh. They had such deep understanding of the faith. And these people, I remember very clearly, when I was 7 or 8 years of age, they were discussing the future of the faith. They're discussing their duties. They're discussing the writings. And among these writings, there was something which nobody could fully answer it, although they answered it. And I'll tell you what the question was and what the answer. And this, when I was flying over, it really struck me very forcefully. As I said, it took me back to those days. The question was this, that we read in the writings of Bahá'u'lláh that this message is for all mankind. We know that. He addresses all peoples of the world. And his teachings are all related to universality for all mankind, you know. Now, you know, those people did not know where mankind was. They had no idea, because, as I said, they were brought up and born in that same town, and they were in the same village, and they would die in the same village probably. But they knew that there were some places far away, and they did not know geography. They did not know anything about geography. And the only thing they knew about these places was because Abdu'l-Bahá had been to Western world, and in his talks, which we had there, we could read the talks of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the towns they had been familiar with, the names of the towns like London, Paris, Chicago, all these names were very common names to those Persians who were reading the writings, but they didn't know where it was. The only thing they had seen was one European. We had one English doctor in Yazd, and he was considered as a superman. You see? That's all they knew of the Western world. And then this was the question. They said, we know the faith is for all mankind, and our duty is to teach them. How can we go all these distances to teach them? We can't go on donkeys. You know, this was very genuine. If you had never seen a car, if you had never seen a bicycle even, this becomes a very genuine question. How can we go with donkeys? And the answer, you know what the answer was? The answer is, this is the cause of God. God will create the means for it. Now, this question has remained with me, and the answer has remained with me. This is the cause of God. God will create the means. And they believed it. But they couldn't visualize it in those days. And now you can realize why I was saying, when I was flying over this area, it brought me very forcefully. Now, all this communication system which has come into the world is so that the message of Bahá'u'lláh can be taught to the people. Otherwise, it would have been meaningless. The faith would have been entirely meaningless. How can you teach a universal faith without having communications? And be sure everything that the faith needs, the facilities for it will come at the time, just at the time. Now, in those days, of course, when the faith was in those early stages of the faith, the believers had direct communication, line of communication with Bahá'u'lláh. They would go, some of them, to meet with him, to see him, to attain his presence. And when they would come back, they would become like balls of fire. They would become magnets, tremendous magnets. Now, one of the aspects of our faith, which we have to really cherish them and to preserve them, is the history of the faith. History of the faith is very rich. And we must not ever produce what they call it stories. It's all right to tell stories, as you say, stories of Bahá'u'lláh, but we must be very clear what we are talking about. We are talking about the history of the faith. These are all parts of the history. These are not stories which you can say from one person to another person to another person, and then it changes completely, and at the end somebody unfortunately may come down and write it down, and it becomes a very distorted picture. We must be very careful what we say, that it is really coming to us from the origin. Now, you have asked me to give you some stories of Bahá'u'lláh, and certainly the sources of these stories are usually the manuscripts or memoirs which have been left behind by the disciples of Bahá'u'lláh. And then we have to be very faithfully conveying this to them. But I wanted today to talk to you a little bit about the majesty of Bahá'u'lláh. The majesty, this is one feature of the manifestation of God. Before I say that, I wanted to mention this point, which is important to, if you ever want to look at a manifestation of God, or to try to even understand Him with our limited mind, we must know this, that the manifestation of God does not reveal His powers and His glory to the eyes of mankind, to the generality of mankind. In other words, He does not come in His naked glory so that all eyes could see Him. This is a very fundamental part of creation. Never manifestations of God have come with this naked glory so that every eye can see them and every person may recognize them. Oh no. They hide their glory to the generality of mankind. If you only have spiritual eyes, you can penetrate through and recognize that glory. And what hides it is their personal side, is their human side, which acts as a veil. You see? Now, this is very important to know this. And the reason Baha'u'lláh mentions this, he says that he could, with the utterance of one word, because you know the word of God is creative, with the utterance of one word, he says, he can make all humanity to become submissive to him, to recognize him, and to be all his enemies to be subdued. But he cannot do this. He will not do this, because if he ever does this, it's against the law of creation. Because if he ever does this, do you realize what will happen? If a manifestation of God would come with all his glory, naked glory, and every person would recognize him, then we will lose our free will. We will become puppets of God. And God says, here I am, I've come here, everybody come, and everybody recognizes me. The whole life, the whole pattern will change. We will lose our free will. This is why the manifestations of God do not reveal their glory to the generality of mankind, but they reveal it to a certain extent to those who recognize them. And this is where the stories of the early believers come in. They recognize, when you recognize him, when you have recognized him, Baha'u'lláh always manifested something of his glory to the believers so that their faith may be perfect, may be 100%. And it is why these people were willing then to give their lives, you know, because you may have faith, but to have certitude is another stage further. And to have certitude, perfect certitude, is still further. And this is why Baha'u'lláh, to every one of his disciples perhaps, who went to see him, you can see in their accounts that they have left behind, they always convey the same thing, that he gave to them something, so many things maybe, which made it clear to them that he was indeed the supreme manifestation of God for this age. And there was no question of doubt or uncertainties in their minds. And therefore they were willing to give their lives. Now, you see, but one aspect of the life of Baha'u'lláh, I think, is his majesty. Although his glory, as I said, he does not reveal it to the generality of mankind, yes, but it comes out a little bit here and there. And his majesty, certainly nobody could rob him of that majesty, of that power. There was a power there that even his enemies could not underestimate or could not overlook. The majesty was there. There are many stories of Bahá'u'lláh which is recorded to us, handed down to us from these disciples and other people, that how the enemies of the faith who were intent upon destroying him, when they came face to face to him, they saw the majesty and they saw this is not an ordinary person. One of the believers, his name is Haji Sayyid Jawad. He's a very outstanding believer of the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh. He knew the Bab and he knew Bahá'u'lláh, and he was one of the early disciples of both of them. One day, some of the Babis, in those days, in the early days of the faith, in the early days of after the declaration of Bahá'u'lláh, as you may know, still there were in the Bahá'í community or in the Babi community, there were a number of people who had recognized Bahá'u'lláh as the one that the Bab had promised, and there were still some who had not. And usually they used to mix. They were mixed together. They used to be together. And in one such gathering, somebody asked this one Haji Sayyid Jawad, who was a very old believer and had met the Bab and had been one of his disciples, to tell them about the Bab and what he looked like, and what was he like. Well, he began to describe the beauty of the Bab and the radiance of the Bab. And he said it reminded him of the story of Joseph, because in the traditions of Islam, it is said that one of the characteristics of the promised one of Islam when he comes is that he will bring about the radiance and the beauty of Joseph. Joseph being one of the manifestations of the old, this is a symbolic figure really in the faith also. He was well known for his beauty, has been mentioned in many of the writings. In the Quran, there is a chapter about Joseph and talks about the beauty of Joseph, you see. And he said, when I met the Bab, when I looked into his face, it certainly clearly brought to me the story of Joseph. Now, by the way, do you know what the story of Joseph is according to the Quran and about his beauty and his radiance? In the Quran, there is a great deal about him. It says that once, when he was taken as a prisoner, he was taken as a slave. He was taken as a slave in Egypt. And this woman who was here in this house, and she owned this whole thing, all this house, and the mistress of the house, she fell in love with Joseph. And all the people in the town began to talk about it, and they said it is not a fitting thing for a woman of her character and her standing to fall in love with a slave. And he said, all right, you come along. And she invited certain women of the town, and she said, you come to my house and I will show you Joseph. I don't know whether you know the story of this or not, but it is mentioned, this is a story which is handed down in Islam, that as every woman who came into the house, she gave him an orange. She gave her an orange to hold it in her left hand. And then she gave them a sharp knife to hold in the right hand. And she said, now I will open the door and I will call Joseph to come out. And as soon as he comes out, I want you to cut the orange into two. And as soon as the door was opened and they saw the face of Joseph, they all cut their own hands. You see, this is to show, it's a story which shows the radiance of Joseph. And this, Haji Sayyid Jawad, describing the face of the Bab, says that he reminded him of that story, Joseph. Now, as I told you, there were some people who had recognized Bahá'u'lláh amongst this group, and some people who hadn't. And those who were Baha'is, they felt now that he had said this, they better ask him to describe Bahá'u'lláh. So they asked him, what about Bahá'u'lláh? He said, if anybody tells you whether he is a friend or whether he's an enemy, if anybody tells you that he has been able to fully look into the face of Bahá'u'lláh and see his eyes fully, be sure he's lying. Because it was impossible, he said. He said, in the first instance, when you went into his presence, you were so carried away by his powers, for his spiritual qualities and powers which was surrounding him, that you would never see anything. And if you were not carried away and you were able to look into his face, he says the power of his eyes were such that it was just like looking into the sun. You had to quickly put your head down because your eyes would water and you couldn't continue. And this story of Haji Mirza Haidar, of this man, of this Haji Sayyid Jawad, has been repeated by so many other people, similar stories. Practically every one of the disciples who have written something about Baha'u'lláh, when they come to describe his face and looking into his face, they say it was impossible. You know that there is another believer, a very well-known believer, one of the great believers of the time of Baha'u'lláh, who lived during Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá's ministries. He's known as Haji Mirza Haidar Ali. I'm sure some of the people in the West now have heard about him because some of his stories are published. He says that whenever you were in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, you were carried away so much with his person, you see, so much carried away, that you couldn't see anything, you couldn't feel anything, you couldn't understand anything physical about him. And he says that you were carried away into the spiritual worlds of God in such wise that when you left him, it would take you, in some cases, some time, a few minutes, a few seconds, to come back to your normal case, normal situation, to your normal condition. And he says this time during which you return to your normal varied from person to person. But he said everyone was the same. It varied from person to person. Somebody was 2 seconds, somebody was 10 seconds. He said it never reached a minute. But in one case, he says, there was only one person who maintained the situation till the end, till he gave his life. He never lost it. He was always in the state of ecstasy for months until he became a martyr of the faith. And that was Bahá'í, the young 17-year-old Bahá'í who took the tablet of Baha'u'lláh. You know the story of it, and how Baha'u'lláh says about Bahá'í, he says, we saw a handful of dust. That is Bahá'í, before he came, and when he came to visit him in the barracks of Akka. He said, we saw a handful of dust. Means he had no spiritual potency within him. He says, we breathed into him a new life. These are almost his words. I'm paraphrasing it. We breathed into him a new life and gave him the powers, made him a new creation. And in fact, the name Bahá'í means a new creation, you see. Now, in fact, in one of his tablets, he says that we know, according to the history which is left behind, that he met Baha'u'lláh twice alone. And Baha'u'lláh says we uttered one word to him. We cannot understand these things. You see, it's beyond us. Not until you are in that position to be facing the manifestation of God, one who embodies the spirit of the most great spirit, which was animating Baha'u'lláh. Not until you're confronted with that can you appreciate this. When Baha'u'lláh says we uttered one word, and with that one word, he says his whole being was disintegrated. And with the utterance of that same word, we created a new life. We breathed into him a new life. And he says at that moment, Bahá'í smiled. He mentions this in the tablet. And he says, with this new creation, all the concourse on high, that is the souls which are passed away, the souls of the prophets and holy souls in the next life. He says, the souls of all the concourse on high were exhilarated and rejoiced for seeing this new creation. You see, this is the man that Haji Mirza Haidar Ali says that he kept that state of ecstasy until he gave his life. And when you read the history of Bahá'í, it's a marvelous story. Now, we go back to our own story of Haji Mirza Haidar Ali. He says that every time you were in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, you were carried away. And when you came back, you realized that you have been in his presence. He says, this man, Haji Mirza Haidar Ali, he stayed 7 months in Adrianople. And he says, every day I used to attain the presence of Baha'u'lláh, sometime once and sometime twice. But he says, when I came out of this presence every day, I would say to myself, what was the shape and the color of the headdress of Bahá'u'lláh? And he couldn't know it. You see, the headdress was a very important part of man's clothing in those days. Unlike today, that you come out with your bare head. In those days, every person, every man had to have his headdress in public. And that's why you see Abdu'l-Bahā's photographs. It's all, you can never see him bareheaded, you see. Shoghi Effendi always had his hat, you see. And Bahá'u'llah's headdress was was a part of his personal clothing. And it was considered, headdressing always determined the status of a person in those days, dependent what sort of a headdress you wore, you see. And this man says, I wanted to look at the color of that, and I didn't know it. And he says, for 7 months, every day, I wanted to know this, and I couldn't. Until Haji Mirza Haydar Ali leaves Adrianople with the permission of Bahá'u'lláh, and then there are a lot of stories of how he is taken a prisoner because of his faith, and he's sent to the Sudan for 10 years in the prison, or not all the time in the prison, but he was confined to the city of Sudan. And when he is released, he goes straight to Akka. Again, he goes into the presence of Bahá'u'lláh. He says, now, after all these years, I still had not seen the color of the headdress of Bahá'u'lláh. Until one day, now he gives us the story of what happened. Now, if you have been to the garden in Akka, there is a place called the Garden of Rizwan. Now, if you go to the Garden of Rizwan, you will see there is a little room. There are 2 or 3, just a few steps. It's not very high up, but a few steps, and then you go into the room. This is a room that Bahá'u'lláh often rested, and sometimes he had revealed tablets there. He said one day he went into the Garden of Rizwan because Bahá'u'lláh was there, and he said the believers were all of them there, or quite a number of them there. And he says when I arrived, the room was full of people, of his disciples, of the believers. And he says, in fact, there was no room for so many people. They all had to stand outside. And he said, I was one of those. And he said, I just stood up in front of the window and I looked inside the room. You can stand in front of the window and peep into the room. And he said, the only thing I could see was the headdress of Bahá'u'lláh. And that is the time, he says, I noticed the color of it, which was, this is how the early believers who have been in the presence of Bahá'u'lláh has described it. Most of them have said, who have written down, who have talked about it, have talked about this aspect, that they could not look into the face of Bahá'u'lláh, the power and the glory. My own father was saying many stories, many such stories. He said that every time that he wanted to ask a question, he would never ask it by the way of the mouth, but he would purely think of it in his heart. And Bahá'u'lláh would turn to him and respond to that question. But he always loved to be able to look fully into the face, just as I'm looking into your face, just to fully see the face of Bahá'u'lláh. And he said one day he was seated, he came in, and this was customary when the friends arrived. Bahá'u'lláh would show them a seat and be seated, and he would sit down then. And then often he would ask his servant, that is his secretary, who also was his servant. Baha'u'llah's amanuensis also was acting as his servant. One of his titles was Abd-Hazir, means servant in waiting. You see, he used to call him Abd-Hazir. Another title he has is Khadimullah, means the servant of God. Now he said, bring tea for him. This was customary. When people came to sit down, Baha'u'llah would ask for a cup of tea for this person. And my father said that he took the cup of tea in his hands. But he said he didn't know what happened, that at that moment his eyes were locked onto the eyes of Baha'u'llah, and he couldn't remove it. And as a result of this, the power which was emanating was so much, it was so much for him that he almost fainted. And the cup of tea fell from his hand. And it burned him, but he didn't see it. He didn't notice it until Baha'u'llah suddenly said, look what you have done. Look what you have done. You have destroyed your clothes. You have And then he said, I saw that I burnt myself. You see, this is the sort of stories that are many of the believers have written like this, that they could not look into the face of Baha'u'lláh. And this is why a great many of these early believers who had attained the presence of Baha'u'lláh and have written their memoirs, none of them have given us a pen portrait to describe what was he looking like, how he looked like. You see, you can always describe the face of somebody. Nobody has ever described it, and this is the reason for it. There's only one person who has described it, and I'll tell you later. But I remember whenever people asked my father to tell us what was Baha'u'lláh like, tell us what Baha'u'lláh was like, he would repeat a Persian poem. That was their answer, a Persian poem, and I'll tell you. It says, من گنگ خواب دیده و عالم تمام کر من عاجزم ز گفتن و خلق از شنیدنش. Means, I am a dumb person. You know, a dumb person who cannot speak. I am a dumb person who has had a wonderful dream. And the rest of the people are all deaf. I am unable to say it, and they are unable to hear it. You see, those people who attained the presence of Baha'u'lláh, their experiences was something personal. It was a spiritual thing, and you cannot convey that spiritual feeling to others. But they were so captivated, sometimes the enemies of the faith would have come into his presence, for some reason. And they all went humbled by the powers which were emanating from him. You must have heard many stories. For years, the governor of Akka was pleading to come into the presence of Baha'u'lláh, and he would not permit him, because he said he could see Abdu'l-Bahá. Because Abdu'l-Bahá in those days in Akka was the person who was in contact with all the public, and Baha'u'lláh had retired really into his own world of revelation and meeting with the believers. But eventually, in fact, this governor was ordered by the central government to come and see Baha'u'lláh. And he came with a European general who was quite a stout man. And both of them came to the presence of Baha'u'lláh. And Baha'u'lláh, they arrived at the room, and Baha'u'lláh showed them to their seats. But they were so overtaken with awe. The power and the majesty has been so great that these two would not come to sit on their seats. And as a sign of humility, both of them knelt at the door. In spite of the fact that they say that this general, this European general, and we haven't been able to identify who that person has been. But Abdu'l-Bahá mentions that European general. He, in spite of his size, they knelt at the door, and it must have been very uncomfortable for them. And after a few minutes of sitting there, and Baha'u'lláh has been talking, they just found that there was nothing for them to say, and in his presence they were so overwhelmed that eventually they got permission and they went. So you see, this is the power which was emanated from this person of the manifestation of God. And now this, I was mentioning to you that therefore we do not have a real pen portrait except one, which is written by a person who was not a Bahá'í, and that is Professor Edward Brown of Cambridge University. Now, as you may know, he went there a year before Baha'u'lláh passed away. He went to Akka, and although Baha'u'lláh very seldom met others who were not believers, and somehow he gave him an audience, and he came to the presence of Baha'u'lláh. You should read for yourself what he describes, what he saw. Although this is not exactly his own words, but I can tell you it's very close to the words of Professor Brown. He says, "The face of him on whom I gazed." See, this is almost his own words. He says, "The face of him on whom I gazed, I can never forget, although I cannot describe it." Now, this is a very, very strong statement to make for a person who says, "I cannot forget a face, but I cannot describe it." And then he says, "Those piercing eyes, used to read one's very soul. Now, what else do you want? Those piercing eyes used to read one's very soul. And he talks about the power and authority which sat on that ample brow. He talks about his majesty, that the kings will envy and the emperors will sigh for in vain. This is the majesty of Baha'u'lláh. One day Baha'u'lláh was walking in the streets of Ak with some of his disciples, a few of his disciples. And at that time, a few of the officials, high-ranking Turkish officials, had come from Istanbul. They did not know anything they had never met Baha'u'lláh before. And in those days, these officials were very proud and very arrogant, to such an extent that if you saw a government official or anybody, especially if they were high-ranking, people in the town had to bow before them. As they passed through the streets, people had to show their respects to them. They were very proud. And as they were walking in the streets of Ak, suddenly they were confronted with the imposing figure of Baha'u'lláh, that majestic figure walking with a few people behind him. And they stood back. And they couldn't help but to bow before Baha'u'lláh, not knowing who it is. And when he passed, and Baha'u'lláh showed them some signs of kindness, loving kindness, and when he passed them, he ran to one of the believers and said, "Who is this? Who is this?" And these are his own words. I'm translating for you. He says, "Is this the King of Kings? Or is this the embodiment of the Holy Spirit?" And this person says, "This is the father of Abbas Effendi." Abbas Effendi is Abdu'l-Bahá. He was so well known this is the father of Abbas Effendi. Now you see, there are many things. Now this is one aspect which I mentioned, is the majesty of Baha'u'lláh. You must not think that although he was a prisoner, and although he always submitted himself to his enemies, I was mentioning in the earlier part, the manifestation of God will never use his powers to stop his enemies persecuting him, for the reason I mentioned. It's impossible. He wouldn't do that. He submits himself as if he has no powers whatsoever. You see? And yet, the majesty is there. The glory, those who have the eyes, they can see that this is not an ordinary person. Well, as I said, there are so many stories which are left behind from the early believers. I'll tell you, some of these stories, of course, I have written already in these volumes, The Revelation of Baha'u'lláh, and you can read them. But maybe saying them, maybe it's slightly different. And I hope that you will not go around and describe these things and then somebody will write it down. I am very nervous about this. I feel we must not circulate a story which goes from ear to ear, and eventually it will become a real. I come across many stories which I don't know about Abdu'l-Bahá. I don't know what to think of it. Sometimes you hear some stories written, or even written, yes, attributed to Abdu'l-Bahá, and when you really listen to it, you think that as if Abdu'l-Bahá had come from Texas, for instance. This is the way they put it. I don't know. Maybe in all good faith, somebody has said a story, and somebody has embellished it. And it goes on from mouth to mouth, and from ear to ear, and at the end, it becomes different. So I think that's a very important point. We must always know the source of what we have, and where it is, and be able to try to convey this. Now that we're talking about Baha'u'lláh, I wanted to mention, I mentioned in the beginning, you remember, that although he did not, the manifestation of God never comes in his naked glory, so that the generality of mankind will not see any difference. They see him as just an ordinary person, unless they have spiritual eyes to really see through that And his human side is really the barrier. He acts like an ordinary person. He appears like an ordinary person. He speaks the same language as his mother's tongue. He has the same customs. He does not rise up above his customs. The manifestation of God does not come and say, oh, Christ did not come and say, oh, well, look, I know that in 2,000 years' time there would be so much prosperity and so many facilities and hygiene, and I'm not going to live like you people in this wretched huts and dwelling houses which was so dirty and filthy. I'm not going to live here. I'm a manifestation of God. I'm going to live like people of 2,000 years from myself. No, he lives just like them. He acts like them. He's just like one of the ordinary people. He appears like this. He never rises up above his generation. This is to this. When he does this, then he really is completely veiled. The glory is veiled in that way, and people have to have spiritual eyes to recognize. But as I mentioned, those who have recognized Baha'u'lláh and have been his disciples, he reveals to them something of that glory, so that their faith becomes confirmed. And there are many such stories which are left behind by his companions, and I'll tell you some of them for you. You know, there is a story attributed to Warqa. Warqa was a great, one of his apostles of Baha'u'lláh. He was one of the great believers. He was a great poet, and eventually he became one of the martyrs of the faith. This is the man who died with his 13-year-old son. And you may have heard the story of him, and his pictures you can see the pictures of the father and the son. He is the grandfather of the present hand of the cause, Mr. Warqa. Now, Warqa went into the presence of Baha'u'lláh. And when he was there for the first time, he knew, of course he believed. We all believe in faith. We all have faith. He had faith. But human nature sometimes questions a lot of things, or some thoughts come to your mind. And these thoughts come in a fraction of a second. And suddenly, as he saw the face of Baha'u'lláh and he saw him, he said to himself, is this really the supreme manifestation of God, one who embodies this the Spirit, the most great Spirit? No. And at that moment, at that fraction of a second, at that split second, when he thought of this, a verse of the Quran flashed into his mind. This also happens, all simultaneously, without taking any time. Immediately. And at this same moment, this thought said to itself, if only Baha'u'lláh would repeat this verse for me, this verse of the Quran, which is just flashed into my mind. This would bring me confirmation. And that he was a believer. He was, of course, a believer. But he wanted to have a confirmation of this in this form, because this is the human weakness. And Baha'u'lláh turned to him, and he repeated that verse of the Quran in the course of his talking as he was pacing up and down the room. Warqa becomes shattered by it. But then at the same time, he, again in a split second form, he says to himself, could this not have been a coincidence? But Baha'u'lláh had said this. And Baha'u'lláh turns to him and he said, in ham kafi nabud, means, was this not sufficient? You see now? Now that man's faith now reached the stage of 100% certitude. You see, that's finished him off. That was enough. That was the end for him. He now has no problem. He is a spiritual giant. And he goes out and he gives his life. Nothing to him. See? This is what Baha'u'lláh did to those who attained his presence. And this is why Shoghi Effendi has said that these men of that caliber will never rise again in this dispensation, because of their contact with the manifestation of God. They became magnetized by him. Powers that they had. And really, if you had seen some of the early believers, as I have, some of those believers who belong to that age, you cannot believe the tremendous power that emanated from them, in spite of the fact that they were constantly being pressurized and persecuted. One of them could stand up, and could overwhelm a public, 1,000 people, in his talk, in his manners, in his attitudes. You see, one person could do it. I'll tell you a story here that my father was telling us that, he said one day he and my brother, who was then a little boy, about 6 or 7 years of age, they were going in the middle of town. They had no idea what had happened in town. But when they arrived at the entrance to the bazaar, they saw there was a great crowd coming. And one of the persons who was not a believer, but he was a friend, he said to my father, go back quickly. They have already killed one of the Baha'is. And they are dragging his body down here. If they see you here, they'll tear you into pieces. And of course it was true, because they always wanted to take his life. They always wanted to take his life. And this is another story that when he was in the presence of Bahá'u'lláh, he wanted to become a martyr of the faith. And Bahá'u'lláh says, no, you must live to teach the faith. And we enable you to grow and to live long life and to teach the faith. And so he lived 102 years. And although everyone wanted to put him to death, they couldn't. And he thought, when this man said, go back, it is dangerous to go forward, they'll tear you into pieces. He thought if he goes back, people will say he's afraid. He'll go forward. And he went forward into this bazaar. And they were you have no idea how these people become savage at the time. They can really tear you into pieces. And as he went forward with his little boy, that's my brother, Habib, holding his hand, as he went along, as soon as the crowd were shouting and doing all kinds of, they became so excited, they were dragging this body, thousands of them in this bazaar, in this narrow space. They stopped, all of them, and became motionless. And they began to stare at him, and he was going the opposite to them. And then they opened up a way, and all they could do was to stare at him until he went all along the bazaar, through them, and went back. And then they began to shout again and said that Abdu'l-Bahá made a miracle. They shouted, somebody said, Abbas Afandi made a miracle. And my father went back this time and then hurried back home. But on the way home, he saw them again, just near our house, the same crowd. And because it was very close to the house, he said, I told my little boy, Habib, to run home. Run, he said, you go and run home. The minute he ran, the crowd surged forward. He told them, come back. And the minute they came back, they all stopped. Now you see, you may not realize the miracle here which is taking place. This is a miracle. This is the power which emanates from these believers. They had this power to overwhelm a crowd if it was their intention. And this is the power that Baha'u'lláh gave to them. I'll tell you, one of the stories which is very interesting also is the story to say how Baha'u'lláh confirmed the faith of every believer who went into his presence practically, those who really needed it in their own ways. One of the believers, known as Agha, and I have written the story of him in this 3rd volume actually, Sa'adati, he says that he had gone from Ishqabad to the presence of Baha'u'lláh. He was actually from Yazd, but he was in the city of Ishqabad. And he says, when I attained the presence of Baha'u'lláh, I was so overwhelmed. And he said, when I sat down in his presence, I decided that I should dedicate this pilgrimage to some friends who are in Ishqabad. And 5 names came to my mind, and he begins to name these 5 people that he wanted to dedicate that day of attaining the presence of Baha'u'lláh to those 5 people. And he said, Baha'u'lláh turned to me after a while, and he said, your intentions are very pure, your motive is pure, and your intentions are accepted by us, and that your pilgrimage on behalf of these 5, and he mentions the name of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these people exactly. And this man becomes so much really overwhelmed that he almost he reaches the point of fainting. To such an extent that Baha'u'lláh calls his servant and he says, bring some sweetmeats into the room. And he hands him one of these sweetmeats to eat, and then he dismisses him from his presence. And he says, when I just went out there, I fell down. I fell on the stairs, and he hurt himself. He was so shaken the whole day. Well, that is the evidence of the power of God. He can see now he's sitting face to face with his God, really, with the power which is emanating from him. And this is what confirmed their faith. One of the believers says that he was standing there along with some other believers. There were several of them. And he says that as Baha'u'lláh was pacing up and down the room, I said to myself, is this really the person who has sent all the messengers of the past? Because you see, this is one of the titles of Baha'u'lláh, the one who has sent all the messengers of the past. You see, Baha'u'llah's revelation is a very great revelation. We must not comparing it with the revelations of the past. This is the revelation of the Father. You know, that of Christ was the revelation of this. He came in the station of the Son, and he said, the Father has sent me, and so on. And Baha'u'lláh says, the Father has come. It's a tremendous revelation. It's a day of God. It's not to be compared with the revelations of the past. It's a revelations that the prophets of the past, Baha'u'lláh says, were longing to be in this day for one moment. And so, this man says, is this the person who has sent all the messengers of the past? And he says, Baha'u'lláh was pacing up and down, and when he reached me, he said, he came to me, he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, yes, we are the one who have sent all the messengers of the past. Now this is enough again for this person. This is what happens to the believers when they came into the presence of Baha'u'lláh. Now I think you can go on and on and on and say these stories. But I think that what we can do in this day and age as Baha'is, we do not have Baha'u'lláh here with us to go and attain his presence. And those who had met with Abdu'l-Bahá, they had felt the same powers. Those who had met Shoghi Effendi, they had felt the same powers, which really carried them away and gave them this great strength in their faith. But we have today to really turn to the writings of Baha'u'lláh and read the writings and turn and fall in love with him. And the only way you can fall in love with him is to see the greatness of this revelation. Not until you see the greatness of this revelation can you fall in love with Baha'u'lláh. You know, in Persian there is a story, a beautiful story of a drop of rain coming down. A drop of rain from the clouds falling down. Now this drop of rain knew that it was the water of life. You know, the water is very precious. It's the most precious element in creation. And therefore it was proud of itself and saying, this is the water of life, I am the water of life. And it was very, very proud of itself. Until as it came down, it suddenly saw a great ocean beneath it. And when it saw the great ocean, it said to itself, if this exists, what am I? If this exists, what am I? He felt so insignificant. It felt so insignificant. And because it said this, the ocean attracted this drop to itself. And it became part of the ocean and became the companion of the pearl. This is the story. It's a very beautiful story. And it's the same way with us. We must see the ocean. Not until we see the ocean can we become really a lover of Baha'u'lláh. And to see the ocean, we must read the writings. We must read the history of the faith. We must study the history of the faith. And I feel one of the greatest contributions that Shoghi Effendi has done to the faith is to tell us what the faith is all about. This is what Shoghi Effendi did. This was his ministry. He told us what the faith was all about. And he has left behind some marvelous works. Amongst them, I feel, which every Baha'i should study if you want to see that ocean. He has helped us. Not that this is the only way, but he has helped us. You should read the dispensation of Baha'u'lláh. And also read those 10 pages at the end of the Advent of Divine Justice, in which Shoghi Effendi enumerates, he brings out, he quotes many passages from the writings to talk about the greatness of this revelation. And when you read those things and you meditate on it, then you see what a tremendous day it is. And then we have to read the writings. Baha'u'lláh says we have to read the writings in the morning and in the evening, both. And when you do this and when you read the history, and then it's not enough just to read the writings and become aware of the greatness of this revelation. You have to serve the faith. When you do all of these things, then we acquire that same vision of faith which the early believers had. And then we really will see in everything a sign of Bahá'u'lláh. And we see in every believer a sign of Bahá'u'lláh. And this is when we fall in love with each other, by looking into each other's faces, and you see a trace of Bahá'u'lláh. He says, I believe, I am a Bahá'í. See? And I think this is really a marvelous way to get closer to Bahá'u'lláh. There's no other way. There's no other way. The rest of it is talk. You have to really see that great ocean. And this should be the goal of every Bahá'í. Well, I have talked an awful lot. I think that's enough, really. As I said, the faith, the history of the faith is very rich. And you can talk and talk about these things that people refer to stories. As I said, I don't like the word stories, because stories has the connotations of telling tales, you know. But this is not. You have to be very careful. This is part of the history of the faith. And the believers who were in contact with Bahá'u'lláh at the time, they were so much filled with his spirit that they were not living in this world. This Haji Mirza Haydar Ali tells us the story. He says, he says everybody was waiting to be summoned to the presence of Bahá'u'lláh. He was longing to be summoned into his presence. And this refers to those who were living in Akka permanently. The pilgrims who came, they had a certain rota of going. For instance, my father had permission to be in the presence of Bahá'u'lláh every other day. But those who were living there, their longing was one day to be summoned to the presence of Bahá'u'lláh. And he says, as soon as he would be called, he would forget everything. He would literally forget everything. He would forget his name even. He didn't know who he was. He would run. He would run until he would reach into the room of Bahá'u'lláh. And he says, when he would arrive there, and when he would come out, it would take him some time to be able to talk to people. And even then he couldn't convey what he had seen, what he had felt. Because, you know, this is true. This is not the cause of man. This is the cause of God. It must be different. It is not just accidental that people, 20,000 of them, give their lives for the faith. And today they are doing the same thing. It is something tremendous from God. It's the power of God. But as I said, let us aim, all of us, for seeing that great ocean. I feel that we should know a little bit about the manner of divine revelation. Although we will never understand divine revelation, because we are human beings and our minds are limited, our world is limited, and the world of the manifestation of God is above us. And you can never understand something which is above you. You can always understand something which is below you, or something which is equal to you, but you can never understand something above you. And the manifestation of God is above us. We will never understand the true nature of the manifestation of God. But all we can do is to observe certain things from our human point of view and marvel at it. That's all we can do. And one of the things which really we can marvel at is this question of the revelation, the manner of revelation, the way revelation came to Bahá'u'lláh. Because divine revelation is not dependent upon knowledge, upon acquired knowledge. You see, we have to acquire knowledge in this life, and then when we acquire knowledge, we accumulate knowledge in our mind, like a computer really, and then you use them sometime, and you read, you study, you make an awful lot of research, and then you probably write something. Write it down, and this is how people write a book. And then they work on it very hard, you know, you have to have the conditions right, you have to be very comfortable, very nice surroundings, and all the comforts in your home or wherever it is, the surroundings. And some people become sentimental. They have to be in very special places, special surroundings in order to be able to write. And when they write, they find so many mistakes. They tear it up again, over and over again. And then eventually, after a lot of troubling, maybe after 6 months or a year, he might write something. And even when it's finished, that work is full of imperfections. He knows it himself. Every writer who is honest will know that he could have done much better at the end. So you see, this is man. But the manifestation of God is not like this. Baha'u'lláh, being the example here, his revelation, when it came, it was not dependent upon learning and knowledge. The soul of the manifestation of God is different from ours in that it has the knowledge of all things when it is born. Our soul is not like this. We have to acquire knowledge in this life. And therefore, but the soul of the manifestation of God has, from the time that has no beginning, has had all the knowledge within it. And this is why when the child is born, he has all the powers within him. All the knowledge is there. Abdu'l-Bahá mentions that we must not think that the manifestation of God becomes a manifestation when he receives his message from God, so to speak. Like Baha'u'lláh in the Siachal of Teheran was where he first received the intimation of his message. But it does not mean that he did not know about it or did not have it already with him. He says it's like a man who is asleep. All the powers are within him, but he doesn't use them. In another example, he says it's like a lamp which is under a bushel. You can't see the powers. Baha'u'lláh himself says, he says that when I was a child, he says, I saw the ocean of revelation within me surging. Oh, and he says, it's never left me. We must never think that Baha'u'lláh did not know about his station until he went into the Siachal of Teheran. You should read some answered questions in which Abdu'l-Bahá describes this passage which Baha'u'lláh has mentioned to the king of Persia, in the tablet to the king of Persia. And many believers think that it means that Baha'u'lláh did not know anything before he received the message, because Baha'u'lláh says, O king, I was but a man. These are paraphrasing his words. He says, O king, I was but a man asleep upon my couch, when lo, the breezes of the All-Merciful were wafted upon me and taught me the knowledge of all that there is. And believers think that this means that he did not know anything about his station until later on. Oh no. Abdu'l-Bahá describes this in some answered questions. You read it. He says this does not mean this, that he did not know or he did not possess those powers of revelation, and it was always with him. He tells us to understand. It means that divine revelation is latent. It becomes active at the time that the call comes, as we say it. And so the revelation of Baha'u'lláh, the manifestation of God, has always these powers within him. In fact, just to give you an example of this, which to show you that how, of course, we knew how Baha'u'lláh knew about this. Of course, he knew about this. As mentioning, he talks about it himself. He says that he saw it within himself when he was a child, even. But just to give you an example of it, and you know also that many disciples of the Bab had recognized Baha'u'lláh during the time of the Bab. They knew that this Baha'u'lláh is the one that the Bab had said is the supreme manifestation of God, the one whom God shall make manifest, the one that has to come and to bring the whole of mankind together. They knew this. People like Tahir had recognized the station of Baha'u'lláh. Quddus, with one of the letters of the living, had recognized the station of Baha'u'lláh. Mullah Hussain had recognized the station of Baha'u'lláh long before even he says anything. But Baha'u'lláh himself, of course, he knew it. You know, this to describe this to you, to sort of show you, to illustrate it for you. You know, when the Bab was in the mountains of Azerbaijan, captive, he received one of his disciples, a man called Sheikh Hassan Zonuzi. And he said to Sheikh Hassan, you are very fortunate, because you are going to see the face of him whom God, the face of the promised one, the face of him whom God shall make manifest. The face of Baha'u'lláh, shall we say, in our understanding. In the city of Karbala. Karbala is in Iraq. Well, this man actually was living in Karbala. He went to Karbala. Now Baha'u'lláh was in Tehran. And a year before he went into the Siachal of Tehran, a year before, Baha'u'lláh went to Karbala. And when he was in Karbala, he met this man. And Baha'u'lláh went to him. It wasn't that the man came to him, but Baha'u'lláh went to him and he says, praise be to God that you have seen the face of him whom God shall make manifest. This man almost collapsed and he went on his knees. Baha'u'lláh said, no. He said, get up. He said, don't do this. Here. He said, keep this to yourself. This is a secret. And this secret will be divulged, will be clear, will be known in Baghdad. He said, keep it. Now you see, this was a year before he went into the Siyah when we say the birth of Baha'i revelation took place. So you see, the manifestations of God have the knowledge which is innate in them from the beginning. And they don't have to acquire it from anywhere. And so when revelation comes to them, it's like I describe it like a receiver like a wireless receiver. A wireless receiver is an instrument which is sensitive to electromagnetic waves. We are not. We are sitting in this room now, and this room is full of electromagnetic waves, full of radio waves, but we don't feel it. But a receiver is the only instrument which can take it and translate it into and give it out as it receives it. This is what a manifestation of God is. And this is why Baha'u'lláh says that this whole heart, in his whole heart is opened the book of creation. Anything he wants, it's there. And this is why when revelation comes to him, it pours from him. But remember, again, I was saying in the other tape that this is a day of God himself, he says. This is not to be compared with the revelations of the past. The revelations of the past were the early stages in the development of man. It was an early stages of prophecies. You see, we had prophets in the past. We had Christ, we had Moses, we had Buddha, we had Muhammad. They were prophets in the sense of giving prophecies. Prophecies of what? Prophecies of the coming of the day of God. This is their function. This was their function. Now, Muhammad was the seal of prophets, which means that after him, the prophecy is ended. It will be the day of fulfillment. And today is the day of fulfillment. So, here is where Baha'u'lláh has brought to mankind a great revelation. And because of that, the revelation of the Word has taken up such a fantastic turn that it is not comparable even with the revelations of the past. I'll give you an example of it. We don't know about the words of Christ because they were not written down on the spot. But we do know about the words of Muhammad, whose words are authentic. They were memorized by people who had marvelous memories and then written down soon afterwards. But you know how long it took for the book of Quran to be revealed? It took 23 years for that book, which is a small book, which has got over 6,000 verses. 23 years. It's like drizzle, like the rain when it comes in the form of a drizzle. One today and one tomorrow, this sort of thing. 23 years. When the Bab appeared, his revelation was such that it is said, his disciples, Wahid describes it, he said in 6 hours, he would reveal 1,000 verses. 1,000 verses is about 1/6 of the Quran. He would reveal it in 6 hours. Now Baha'u'lláh would reveal that 1,000 verses in 1 hour. Now you can see the rapidity and the way the revelation poured from him. The Bab in 6 hours, 1,000 verses. Baha'u'lláh in 1 hour, 1,000 verses. So powerful was this revelation that his secretary could not cope with it. In the Arabic and Persian languages which were revealed, the original words, we do not have shorthand. You have to take it longhand. And you cannot, the secretary could not cope with it. But he had developed a system, and I will describe it to you. When you look at these revelation writings, which is when revelation came, the secretary of Baha'u'lláh would take it down as best as he could. And of course, there were times that Baha'u'lláh himself would write it with his own pen. And I will tell you later on maybe a story about this revelation about the writings of Baha'u'lláh in his own handwriting. You'll keep it there. I'll come back to this. But let me say in here that his amanuenses would sit down in a corner, piles of paper, and in those days we had bamboo pens. Pens were made of bamboo reeds. They had to be sharpened, and they often would break. And so he had several of these pens ready, and an ink pot. And then he would be sitting there with piles of paper, and paper had to be large-sized papers, and there is a reason for it. I will explain to you why these papers had to be large. Rather, much bigger than our, or quite bigger than our ordinary A4 sizes that are now used. Now the reason is this, that if you want to write very fast, normally you hold a pen, if I show it to you here, I have a pen here, I'll show you. Here is a pen. You normally hold a pen between your fingers, and then you write it down. But and then you move your fingers and you write down. And when you move your fingers, the movement is slow. You can't really write fast. But because he had large sheets of paper, he would not move his fingers to write. He would move his wrist. And when you move a wrist, you can write one word, which would take the whole length of a paper, or two words. And these words will go into each other. And so one page would be finished very quickly. That if you write it properly, it would be maybe 3 or 4 lines. And then he had difficulty in reading it again, and often he had to ask Bahá'u'lláh about this. And then he would, after an hour or 2 hours of continuous revelation, he would go back into his room, and then he would rewrite it again. And when he rewrites it again, he brings it to Bahá'u'lláh, not always immediately, but he would have piles of these tablets ready. And Bahá'u'lláh would tell him, be seated. And he would sit down there. And then he often would pace up and down the room. And he would re-reveal the same tablet as if he knew it all by his heart. And then Mirza Agha Jan, who was Baha'u'llah's secretary, would check it, see, make the corrections if it was necessary. And then Bahá'u'lláh would approve it to be passed on, which meant that there were people who were transcribing the writings. There were a great number of people. In those days, they did not have typing machines. People had to write them down and made copies of them. Several copies were made in this way. Now, this is how revelation came. But this is not, the rapidity was so much that it would overwhelm any person. For instance, you see the Kitab-i-Iqan, which is, you must have seen it. The Kitab-i-Iqan is about 200 pages or something like this. That book must have been revealed in 3 or 4 hours. Because the person who asked the questions, he wrote the questions down and sent them to Bahá'u'lláh. 48 hours later, the answers, which we now call it the Book of Certitude, was the answers to this man, were revealed and handed over to him 48 hours later. Now, it doesn't mean it took 48 hours to be revealed. It meant that during this period, Bahá'u'lláh had to do many things. He had to eat, he had to sleep, he had to do other things. A few hours, this has been revealed. And Abdu'l-Bahá, actually, it's in the handwriting of Abdu'l-Bahá, the first copy of the Kitab-i-Iqan, as we know it. And then it was handed to him. So you see, it is the pouring out. This is the day of God. It's not we cannot compare it with the past. This is why, if you put together the writings, we have no less than 100 volumes if you put them together. There are about 15,000 tablets of Bahá'u'lláh, some of them 1 page, some of them 10 pages, some of them 20, some of them 30 pages, more. And then a greater part, maybe, or a great part of the revelation of Bahá'u'lláh was not recorded. You know, when he was in the mountains of Sulaymaniyah for 2 years, and all the time, probably, constantly. When he was meditating and pouring upon this world, the words which poured from him into the open air, and nobody wrote it down. And when he came to Baghdad, after that time of Sulaymaniyah, Nabil tells us, he says, every day and night, that's every 24 hours, the equivalent of the Quran would have been revealed, but not recorded. And he says this continued for some time, for some years. So you can imagine, this world was immersed in the ocean of revelation, really. And what we have, what is left to us, is what has been recorded and kept. But this is not the only aspect of divine revelation. Another aspect of it, which is a very important aspect, is that the person of the manifestation of God, at the time of revelation, the person of Bahá'u'lláh was so overwhelmed with this outpouring of the words, that it was not like the ordinary time that he was talking to the friends or to his disciples. He often was alone at the time of divine revelation. No one could stand this this power which was emanating from him, the power of the word. The word that cannot be changed. This is another aspect of it. I was telling you an author has to change his words hundreds of times. But the word which is uttered from the mouth of the manifestation of God cannot be changed. That's finished. And that word become the mother work, become creative. And it pours out of him, and that's finished. It's like you hear a receiver. The word has uttered. He can't take it back. He can't say, wait a minute, I'll change this word. He could never say to his secretary, look, use a different word for it. I didn't mean this. This is not the manifestation of God. Even if the word even was not grammatically right, for instance, take it for example. Although this is not really the case always. He couldn't take it back. So, these words which poured from him was so powerful, the effect of it, that his disciples, his followers, could not be present at the time. But some of them would beg Baha'u'lláh to allow them to come at the time of revelation. And they would come at the time of revelation. And they would stand usually in the corner. And after 1 or 2 minutes of revelation, Baha'u'lláh knew that they could not take it. He would, with the movement of his hands like this, he would dismiss them. Means you go now. And these people would be so shaken as a result of this experience of seeing the face of Baha'u'lláh. The powers emanating from him was so overwhelming that they say that some people used to peep through the room and they would faint. Now, one of these, we can understand that to some extent, and I'll tell you, as human beings, we can understand this. You know, if ever somebody comes into this room now and gives you a very, very important news, say a very shocking news, shall we say, really shocking news now, what happens to you when you hear it? You will be so overwhelmed that if I look into your face, I say, now, this person, you might even faint. Some people faint. Why is it? It's because you have become the channel of communicating some things through you. Something has gone through you. A message has gone through you. And that has overwhelmed you. Now, how much more would you see would be the overwhelming influence of the Word of God, the power of the Spirit of God, which penetrates through a human being. And this is why Baha'u'lláh says when revelation came to him, all his body would be put on fire as if it were. It wasn't an ordinary thing. And so when you see these words which were revealed by him with such majesty and power, that Abdu'l-Bahá says after revelation was finished, Baha'u'lláh could not eat his meal for a long time. Sometime for days he was hungry, depending on the nature of divine revelation, on the nature of the tablets he had revealed. So this is another effect of the revelation of the word which had upon the people. I can tell you so many stories which are left behind by the early believers about the effect of seeing Baha'u'lláh in that mood, in that position of revealing, and how much it really shook them. They were shaken as a result of this experience. My father has one stories about him. But anyhow, I will want to, now that I've talking about this, I'm going to tell you a story which has been given to us by my father again. As I said now, keep on saying my father, and I must say this here, it's not a bad thing to say this. You know, one of our problems in this age is that we talk, the word I is a very bad word, let me put it this way. I this and I that, my things. And it is rather a repugnant sort of a word. Really, this is a word that one day probably will be taken out of human vocabulary. All the problems in this world is because people want to be somebody, to elevate themselves. Whereas Baha'u'lláh says in this life there are 3 stations, he says, 3 stations that God has created, 3 levels. One is that of God, which is above us and we can never reach it. One is the manifestations of God, which is also we cannot reach it. And he says the station of man is that of servitude. This is what God has given to us, station of servitude. And the greater the servant, the lower you go. Abdu'l-Bahá reached to the stage of servitude to such an extent that nobody can reach him as low as that. And he himself says that when he was a child, he asked Baha'u'lláh to give him this station. And he offered to him the station of servitude, which means that no one can reach him as low as that. Now, Baha'u'lláh is like the summit of a mountain, you know. Abdu'l-Bahá is like the lowest valley below. And when the water pours from that level, from the top, where does it end up? It all is accumulated in the low valley, the lowest valley. And this is why Abdu'l-Bahá becomes the repository of all the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. Everything he brought, he gave it to Abdu'l-Bahá. This is the meaning of the covenant, really. All the forces of the revelation of Baha'u'lláh, you can find it in Abdu'l-Bahá. He gave it to him. He said, there it is. Outside him, you cannot get anything. Now, so you see, as I was saying, the word I is not really for us to say. But I just didn't mean to talk about this too much. But just because I said my father, it just gives you a feeling that... Anyhow, I must tell you this because it's a fact that he was telling us. I'll tell you a story about him when he was in the Holy Land. He went there when he was quite a young man, about 27 or 28 years of age. And he was so carried away by the power of Baha'u'lláh, and he revealed to him his glory and his majesty so much that, as I told you before in the other tape, as soon as he would say, think of something in his heart, he said, he always asked him things by the way of his heart. And Baha'u'lláh invariably responded to him. And he always wanted to have a tablet. When he was in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, he always felt he would like to have a tablet in the handwriting of Baha'u'lláh. Now, I must tell you something about tablets in the handwriting of Baha'u'lláh. Baha'u'lláh often had written in the earlier days of his revelation in his own handwriting. And then, when he was in Adrianople, he was poisoned, as we know, by Mirza Yahya, his half-brother, who was the greatest enemy of the faith of Baha'u'lláh. And then, as you may know the story of Baha'u'llah's poisoning, how he was miraculously, through his own power, really, it was a deadly poison which would have killed anybody. But nevertheless, it remained with him a shaking hand. And his hand was shaking after that. And as a result of this, the tablets, if he has ever written anything after that, you can see the effect of the shaking hand. And he seldom took pen in his hand then afterward. Although there are some tablets, yes, there are some tablets to Abdu'l-Bahá, to others, his Will and Testament, and some other tablets which are in his own handwriting, but very seldom. However, tablets in those days would go to the tablets of Baha'u'lláh would be sent to the believers, but they were in the handwriting of one of his scribes who were then present. And sometimes Abdu'l-Bahá often was, in the days of Baha'u'lláh, was engaged in transcribing the writings. You come across many tablets of Baha'u'lláh which are written in the handwriting of Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, these tablets would be the most precious things that people would possess. And many believers had them. My father had many tablets, or some tablets of Baha'u'lláh in this way. But he always wanted to have a tablet in his own handwriting. It was a different thing. The Bab mentions, evidently, although I haven't come across this, but I remember my father was saying this. He says that the Bab had said that if ever you come in contact with him whom God shall make manifest, that is Baha'u'lláh, try to get from him a tablet in his own handwriting. He says such a tablet is more precious than all that is on heaven or on earth. And he says if you cannot get a tablet, get a line. If you cannot get a line, get a word. And so you can imagine how much this was prized by the believers, and my father was very wanting to have it. But every time he thought of this, Baha'u'lláh would smile at him. And then eventually, my father went to Mirza Agha Jan, who was Baha'u'llah's secretary. And in those days, it was customary, in fact, for the believers to say everything they had, to write all their letters, would go to Secretary of Baha'u'lláh, They would not address usually Baha'u'lláh, but they would address to Mirza Ajahn Baha'u'llah's secretary. And so he went to him and he said, look, could you ask Baha'u'lláh to write a tablet for me in his own handwriting? Mirza Ajahn said, this is impossible. He said, since Baha'u'lláh was poisoned, he seldom has taken a pen in his hand. It's impossible. And I do not mention it, and you should forget about it. It's impossible. Forget about this. Well, he says the next day that he went into the presence of Baha'u'lláh, as soon as he arrived, and he told him to be seated, he turned his face to him and he said, praise be to God that I have written a tablet for you in my own handwriting. Now you can imagine the joy that really overwhelmed him so much with this joy of being promised this tablet. Anyhow, some time passed and he didn't receive this tablet. Mirza Ajahn was surprised to hear this. That's Baha'u'llah's secretary. And then some time passed. In those days it was customary when you went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and usually people would walk all these thousands of miles of distances. They usually walked or went on donkeys. That was the best if they could do on donkeys. As you went from town to town on this journey, on this long journey, the believers would say to you, please, when you are in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, mention my name. Now this mentioning of the name of the believers in the presence of Baha'u'lláh is a very important vision of our faith. Baha'u'lláh mentions in his tablets that if the name of a person is mentioned in his presence, the bounties, it talks about the bounties which will be flooding the soul of that believer. And this is why the believers always wanted their names to be mentioned. Well, he had this long list of the believers, and he gave them to Mirza Ajahn, Baha'u'llah's secretary, to bring it to the notice of Baha'u'lláh. And one day, Baha'u'lláh said to my father, he said that the list of names that you had brought for us has been read in our presence. And for each one of them, we have revealed a tablet. Now, it didn't mean in his own handwriting now. Just as I said, in those days, tablets would be revealed, but it would be in the handwriting of his scribes. He said, for every one of them, we have revealed a tablet. But for you, I have written a tablet in my own handwriting. You will get that. Now, that was the second time that Baha'u'lláh promised him this. And so he was very delighted with this. Anyhow, time passed, and eventually came the time that he was to leave the Holy Land. And he said that he was to accompany. When he was to leave, he was very sad, and he was so much crying. He did not want to go. And he was really made it very clear that he did not wish to go. And Baha'u'lláh urged him, and he told him that he should go there and to teach the faith, and he told him how to teach the faith. And he said that he will empower him all the time in his teaching activities, and that he was assisted really in all his teaching activities. He knew, he was saying that to whoever he spoke who was receptive, when he talked to them, they became Baha'is. And he knew he had nothing to do with it. This is one thing. It was all Baha'u'lláh who was doing through him. But he insisted to my father that he should go to Yazd and to engage in teaching the faith. He said, work half a day and the rest you should teach the faith. And his program for many years, as far as I can remember, it was that he would go to bed. He would work early in the morning. His work was very humble work of hand weaving. A hand weaver, and this was in our house. And then he would do this, and then half a day, and then he would have his lunch, and then he would go to sleep in the afternoon all day. And then at night he was fresh, and he would go to these firesides, which was kept. He was teaching, and this is how he lived his life. And he said to people that he talked, they became Baha'is, many of them. So he told him then in Akka, Baha'u'lláh said, now you must go to Yazd and you must teach the faith, and we give you this power, and don't be worried. He said, I have written a tablet for you in my own handwriting. You will get it. Now this was the third time that he promised him. He said, you will get it in Yazd. Well, my father went back and he saw that all those people who had their name were mentioned in the presence of Baha'u'lláh, and he had the list of all their tablets came. not through the post. You know that in those days these things went always through individuals, because post was dangerous. I mean, it would never reach to the hands of anybody. And it was also dangerous, in fact, to carry tablets from one country to another, from one town to another. It was even dangerous. Anyhow, I will not go into that story. But he said everybody got their tablets, but his never arrived. And when he went to Yazd, to his own town, he found that his mother was just going to go to the Holy Land on pilgrimage, because her permission had come from Bahá'u'lláh that she could go on pilgrimage. And in those days, it was impossible for women to travel on their own. So he thought of a good idea. I will go with my mother. That's another excuse. And so he had to get permission from Bahá'u'lláh. So they wrote to Bahá'u'lláh to see that because his mother is coming, that he's going to take his mother with him. And Bahá'u'lláh immediately responded. He said, no, I told you to remain in Yazd and teach the faith, and I have written a tablet for you in my own handwriting. You will get it. It looks like... Well, anyhow, so somebody else went with my mother, and then my mother went to the Holy Land, and Bahá'u'lláh permitted her to remain there. She spent all her life then in the Holy Land, near the mansion of Bahá'í. She lived there, and then she died. And when she died, Bahá'u'lláh himself went to the funeral, and some tablets were revealed for her. Anyhow, but now and again, when that mother was in the Holy Land, in the presence of Bahá'u'lláh, Bahá'u'lláh would tell her to say to your son that I have written a tablet for him. Tell him to teach the faith and engage himself in teaching the faith. I have written a tablet for him in my own handwriting. Well, years passed and this tablet did not arrive, until there was a time that the enemies of the faith were determined to take his life in Yazd. And they had one of the great mujtahids, that is the leading divine, the leading clergyman of the city, had written his death warrant. And it was thought that he should leave the city. And in the middle of night, he was to leave the city. And when he was going to leave the city in the middle of night, and in those days, you know, the only form of transportation was by donkeys, and donkeys were brought in so that he could go out. He said that then at that time, an old Bahá'í woman arrived. And she had something wrapped in a silken handkerchief. And she brought it in. And she said to my father, she said, I had this in my possession for a very long time. Many, many years. And this is a tablet of Bahá'u'llah's handwriting. And I have realized now that it belongs to you. And my father said, when did you get this tablet? She said, you know, this tablet has been in my possession for years and years. And the story of it is that when Bahá'u'lláh was in Baghdad, now you know my father met Bahá'u'lláh in Akka. But when Bahá'u'lláh was in Baghdad, and that is when my father must have been 5 or 6 years of age, one of the very well-known believers went to Baghdad, a man called Razarruh. He's a well-known, outstanding believer of that area. He went and saw Bahá'u'lláh in Baghdad. Bahá'u'lláh, when he was leaving his town to come to Yazd, when he was leaving Baghdad, Bahá'u'lláh wrote a few lines of a prayer in his own handwriting, in Arabic, which is really for an individual, but doesn't give the name of the individual. And he gave it to this person, and he said, take it to Yazd, and leave it with somebody. Its owner will be found later on. Now at that time, as I said, my father must have been 4 or 5 years of age. And this tablet was kept he came to Yazd, and he didn't know to whom he should give this tablet. And then he gave it to this woman, because in those days women were not persecuted, as you know, they were in that way secure and safe, and men usually would be at any time may have to give their lives. And so this woman kept it until that time. And then she died, this woman, soon afterwards. And later on, he knew that this is what Bahá'u'lláh had promised him. And later on, Abdu'l-Bahá said to the believers that if anybody has a tablet in the handwriting of Bahá'u'lláh, they could, if they wanted it, send it to the Holy Land. Because this is a very important principle. Many believers have these precious items like the tablets of Bahá'u'lláh or Abdu'l-Bahá in their handwriting, and no one has the right to say you must send it to the Holy Land to keep it in the archives. They can do it if they want to. This is their property. And the Kitab-i-Iqan is the best example. It was in the hand of the descendants of the person for whom the Kitab-i-Iqan was written up until 1948. And some people wanted to put pressure on her to send it to the Holy Land. It's the most precious thing we have. And Shoghi Effendi said that they should not pressurize her. If she could send it, if she wanted it. And eventually she did send it on her own volition. So anyhow, Abdu'l-Bahá said to the friends that if anybody wants to send in these tablets, if they are in the handwriting of Bahá'u'lláh, they can do it. And so my father gave it to one of the pilgrims and said, give this to Abdu'l-Bahá. Now Abdu'l-Bahá read this tablet, and he looked at it and he read it, and then he put it in the envelope, gave it back to this pilgrim, said, go and give it to him back. This tablet should not be here. This is his own. Baha'u'lláh has specially revealed it for him. He should keep it. So we had this in our family until 1948 actually, and then we gave it to the archives amongst other things, because really that's the place for it. But I have a photocopy of it. It's produced in this first volume of the Revelation of Baha'u'lláh. You can see the photocopy of that tablet, a little bit of a story of it. So you see, this is how the early believers lived their lives. They were so much I with Baha'u'lláh in every way. I will tell you one more story of Baha'u'lláh, and this is something that I have not yet written it down, and I hope that nobody will publish this, because it's better to be written form. Even now that I say it, is not going to be as accurate as it is, as when it is recorded, because one has the source in writing. But you can hear it, of course, as I'm saying it. But this is a story which is a fascinating story of the time that Baha'u'lláh was going to go to the mansion of Bahji. As you know, Baha'u'lláh spent over 2 years and some 5 months in the barracks of Akka. Then, for about 7 years, he was in the houses, first in 3 houses, and eventually ended up in this house of 2 houses which were joined together. One was called the house of Udi Khammar, and one was called the house of Abud. These 2 houses were joined together. Abud and Udi Khammar were relatives, and they were outstanding people of the town. They were Christians, and Arab Christians, you see. And they had, first Udi Khammar gave his house to Baha'u'lláh. It's a tiny little house, which is in the back of the house, what we call it Abud now. And later on, Abud gave the other part, so that the 2 houses became together, and now the 2 is known as the house of Abud. And Udi Khammar went and he completed a building which was left outside Akka in Bahji. The first floor was built, and he built the 2nd floor on it, and he finished what we call it the mansion of Bahji for himself, to go and live there, a life of luxury. But God had a different plan for it, obviously. He built it, but then eventually the outbreak of cholera at one stage drove a lot of people out, and he left entirely that area and went away. And Abdu'l-Bahá rented this from him. And Baha'u'lláh eventually moved to that palace of Bahji. And before that, of course, you know that Baha'u'lláh moved to the mansion of Mazra', another place. And how he moved is another story. You know that Baha'u'lláh, for 9 years, therefore, was in these houses. 2 years in the barracks, 7 years in these houses, house of Abud eventually. And although when he was in the house of Abud and the house of Udi Khammar, there was relatively easier for Baha'is to come and see him in his presence. But the room was small, and it was very there was not a blade of grass there that you could look at. He had never seen, for 9 years, Baha'u'lláh said, he had never seen any green things. And he was very fond of the outside, the nature and things like this. And so when he said this, that it is for 9 years that I haven't seen this, Abdu'l-Bahá knew that that it's the time for him. It means that his intention is to leave that part, and therefore he went there and he rented this garden, beautiful house outside, a beautiful summer house outside Akka, known as the palace of, as the qasr, as the mansion of Mazra'. And when he reported to Bahá'u'lláh, and he made a carriage for him specially, which was something very a novelty there, and he said that I have got a carriage and the house is there, will you please move to it? Bahá'u'lláh said no, he would not, because he was a prisoner and he would not move. You know, as I said, the manifestation of God never violates these things. He is a prisoner and he submits himself to his enemies. So Abdu'l-Bahá knew that he cannot do anything with Bahá'u'lláh. He could not say it again and insist. So he went along and he saw the Mufti of Akka, who was a great admirer of Bahá'u'lláh, a very, very great admirer. He almost worshipped Bahá'u'lláh. And he told him, now you go there and insist that he could go out of this. And this man came and he said to Bahá'u'lláh that he will not leave here until he promises him that he will leave this house and go to the outside into the open country. And the governor had already given his consent quite a long time before that they were free to move out. In spite of the fact, and this is one of the great majesty, it shows the power of God, power of Bahá'u'lláh, that officially he was a prisoner. And this order of the Sultan was that he should never even meet with a member of his own family till the end of his life. He was to have a solitary confinement. And look at what happened. The local people wouldn't ever implement that. And they insisted and insisted, this man insisted, this religious leader, which is much more important than the governor of the city, he insisted so much that Bahá'u'lláh said, okay. And so he went into this palace, into this mansion of Mazra'. And after 2 years, he went to the qasr, to the mansion of Bahji, that you all have seen. Well, my father was at the time in the Holy Land that Bahá'u'lláh was about to move from Akka to the mansion of Bahji. You mustn't also think that when Bahá'u'lláh left Akka and he went into the mansion of Mazra', he never went back to Akka. Oh no. On the contrary, many times he would go back to Akka and would live in Akka probably in the winter time. It was really the summer and the springtime that he would come into the country's house. So when Bahá'u'lláh left Akka, when he went to the mansion of Bahji, he really left Akka. He didn't go from the other mansion to this mansion, but he went from Akka to the mansion of Bahji. And at that time, my father was in the Holy Land. And he tells us the story. Something which is only good for him who has seen it. You know, we must not relate miracles to Bahá'u'lláh. He told us this. He's told us that miracles, if you attribute miracles to him, it will degrade the station of the manifestation of God. Really, it will degrade him. These are only good for people who have seen them. And whenever we say such things, it doesn't mean that we are saying it to prove, therefore, Bahá'u'lláh is a manifestation of God. You can never say this. Look at what happened to the Bab at the time of his martyrdom. You know the story of the martyrdom of the Bab. But we never bring that story up and say, now this is therefore, you can say that Bab was a manifestation of God, because 750 shots did not affect him. And this is not something what we say. Even the enemies have said it. Even the people who were unbiased have written about this. Now, so you see what I'm saying to you now, what I'm going to say to you, is something that you must take it in that way. This is only good for the people who have seen it. Now, what he says is what happened was that originally, when Bahá'u'lláh was about to move into this mansion of Bahji, first his family moved in. And you may know that Abdu'l-Bahá did not go with Bahá'u'lláh to the mansion of Bahji. He remained in Akka. And so did his mother and his sister, that is the greatest holy leaf. They did not move to the mansion of Mazra', to the mansion of Bahji, because if they had moved there, he knew that one of the reasons anyhow was that he did not want to make his brothers very jealous of this, because Bahá'u'lláh had such a love for Abdu'l-Bahá, such a feeling of joy and love for him. He adored him. Abdu'l-Bahá. And he showers his bounties upon him to such an extent that the other brothers would become very, very jealous. This is him. You see, they had no spiritual qualities. This is one thing you must know. The family of Bahá'u'lláh, the other sons of Bahá'u'lláh, had no spiritual qualities. They were only after ambition and position in this life. And there are many stories that we have no time to tell you about this. And this is why later on they all became covenant breakers. All of them. In this way, the only way that you can remain in this faith is to have the standard of servitude. If you're a servant, you're safe. The minute you want to have an ambition, it's all right if you have an ambition in a local community or a national community, you hurt yourself very much and you may hurt the community. It's like a man who falls on the floor and he hurts his knee. But if you are flying in an aircraft, on a high aircraft, if you fall, that's the end of you. And this is what happens to people who are close to the center of the faith. If they have the slightest impurities, the slightest feeling of ambition and leadership is there, you are destroyed. You're going to be destroyed. There's no question about it. There's no question about it. Because the faith is based on servitude. And that's all it is to it. Humanity is based on this. Now these sons of Baha'u'lláh did not have this quality. And so they all of them fell. And even some of the believers, my own father was said when he saw them during the time that they were not covenant breakers, during the time of Baha'u'lláh, everybody would respect the sons of Baha'u'lláh, he said, we could see that they had no spiritual qualities. No, this was something which I have no time to tell you stories of. But anyhow, let us go back to the other story. Abdu'l-Bahá did not go with Baha'u'lláh to the mansion of Bahji. He remained behind. And Baha'u'lláh often writes to him and he says, please come today, there is such and such a meeting. He always loved to have even an excuse to invite Abdu'l-Bahá. And whenever Abdu'l-Bahá was to come to the mansion, he would send all the men, people, everybody who was there, he would send them a mile ahead to welcome him as a welcoming party. The master is coming. Go and bring the master. This is what Baha'u'lláh would say to him. And he himself would stand up on the balcony watching him coming, and he often would say, look at the majesty of the walk of the master, the way he walks. He really adored Abdu'l-Bahá. Not because he was his son, physical son, but because he was the center of his covenant. It was the one who was going to contain and have all the revelation of Baha'u'lláh being given to him. Now, I must go back to the story we were saying. So now, first the family of Baha'u'lláh moved to the mansion of Bahji. And they prepared the way for him, for his coming. And they prepared everything. And there was a lamp, he said, a very special lamp. The Baha'is of India had sent to Baha'u'lláh, an oil lamp. In those days, lamps were burning with oil, as an oil and a wick. And it was a very unusually large lamp, evidently. And it was left in the middle of the mansion. And in those days, of course, the countryside was all dark at night. And this would shine. Anyhow, he says that the day that Baha'u'lláh, a few days after his family moved to the mansion, a few days afterwards, Baha'u'lláh was to go to the mansion. And that day, my father and Nabil, both of them, were staying in their room. And the room was in a place called Suq Yazd, the white market in Akka, which means the room that they had was such that you could see if Baha'u'lláh would pass in front of it, you could see him. And they were watching him to come in front. And then Baha'u'lláh came at about sunset, before the sunset. He said, we saw him riding on this donkey, and behind him was Mirza Agha Jan, a few yards behind him riding on his donkey, and they were coming out to go from here to go outside Akka. And he said, Nabil said to my father, let us follow. So the two of them followed them. And he said, soon it became dark. And then he said, we reached the mansion, near the mansion. And when we reached near the mansion, he said, we saw that the door opened and Baha'u'lláh went in. Then Nabil and my father went forward to circumambulate. The circumambulation is a marvelous spiritual principle. You see, always a lover circumambulates around his beloved. You see, it's like a star and a satellite. The satellite is in love with the mother earth. It revolves around it. It's a love. If you are in love, you revolve around it. And this circumambulation is a symbol of love. So they went forward to circumambulate. And when they were close, they saw 4 sides of the mansion was packed with people. Now, they were not psychic people. They were not imagining it. They were very clear-headed. And who were they? Nobody had come from Akka. Akka did not have all this population. It was nighttime. Everybody was sleeping they were all at their homes. And they knew that this was what Baha'u'lláh often refers to him. He says that when he ascended his throne, he had ascended his throne. This was the throne of God, really, the mansion of Bahá'í. He said, all the souls of the manifestations of God and the concourse on high circumambulated the throne of God. And they knew that they were in the presence of all the souls of the manifestations of God and the holy souls who had come to circumambulate as he ascended on his throne. After all, this mansion of Bahá'í really was the climax of the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. It was a throne of His Majesty. And so overwhelmed, they went back. And when they reached home, Nabil said, tonight we must not sleep. Because of the immensity of what we saw, we must not sleep. And so he said to my father, you make tea and I'll write poems. Nabil's stories are often written in poetry. And he wrote this poem about all this event. And the next day, they sent this to Baha'u'lláh. This poem, which gives the whole story of the mansion and how they moved, how Baha'u'lláh moved and what they saw, all of this. And each one of them sent Baha'u'lláh a present, and it was customary, of a sugar cone, which is today like sending a box of chocolate to somebody. And Baha'u'lláh revealed a tablet for both of them, in the name of both, saying that they were present at the time, that the concourse on high were circumambulating the shrine, the throne of God. And he says that their pilgrimage is accepted by God, and that he gives a new name to each one of them. He calls Nabil the name of Nightingale, Bulbul, Nightingale, and to my father he gives the title of Bahaj, which means the bringer of joy. Now, as I said, I don't think that these stories really should be recorded somewhere in writing or transcribed, but you can hear it, of course, and say it. But really it is, and this particular last story, I have not yet fully translated it from the original, and hopefully, God willing, I will one day. But, and again, as I said, we are saying these things to look at the majesty and the power of God. But everyone has to recognize Baha'u'lláh by his own feelings, through his own heart, through his own study, and then you come closer and closer to him. And as you come closer and closer to him, you fall in love with him more and more. Well, that's the end of the story.